Clara Whitmore slammed both palms flat on that man's table so hard the coffee cups rattled off the edge and shattered on the floor, and every single person in that trading post went dead silent. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't water. She looked Nathan Caldwell straight in his smug, well-fed face and said, "You can laugh at this body all you want, but these hands just kept 60 people from starving to death on that mountain, and you didn't save a single soul." If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next will change the way you see everything. Clara Whitmore pressed her dead father's rolling pin against her chest and stood outside the only bakery left in Durango that hadn't already turned her away, and she told herself she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of another man who looked her up and down before she'd said a single word. She'd been doing this for 6 weeks, walking through doors, holding her head straight, watching the light go out of men's eyes the moment they got a good look at her, and she had 17 cents left in her coat pocket and exactly 2 days before the rooming house landlady would change the lock. She pushed that door open anyway. The man behind the counter looked up from his ledger. He was heavy-set himself, with flour on his apron and a kind enough face, and for just one heartbeat, Clara thought this one might be different. "I'm here about the cook position," she said. "I saw the notice in the window." He looked at her. Not at her face. Not at her hands. The hands that had been making bread since she was 6 years old, the hands her father always said were touched by something holy. The hands that could feel when dough was right, the same way some people could feel a change in weather. He looked at all of her slow and deliberate, the way men did when they'd already made up their minds. "We need someone fast on their feet," he said. "Someone who can move quick in a tight kitchen." "I can move plenty quick," Clara said. No offense meant miss. "Then don't say something offensive." He blinked, set his pencil down. "We're looking for someone more suited to the physical demands," he said. "That's all I'm saying." Clara stood there for 3 full seconds. She thought about her father, about the way he used to say, the measure of a cook wasn't the size of their body, but the size of their heart. She thought about the 6 weeks of doors and eyes, and the particular way a person's face changed when they decided you weren't worth their time. She thought about 17 cents and a locked door. Then she put her father's rolling pin back in her bag, turned around, and walked out. She did not slam the door. That would have given him something to remember, and she didn't want him to have it. She stood on the boardwalk outside in the thin October air and breathed. The mountains to the north were already white at their peaks. People walked past her without looking at her. A dog crossed the street. A wagon rolled through the mud. The world kept going the way it always did, indifferent and loud, and entirely unbothered by the fact that Clara Whitmore was standing in it with 17 cents and nowhere left to go. She pulled her coat tighter. That was when she saw it. It was tacked to a post at the far end of the trading post across the street, a piece of paper rain-spotted and curling at the corners, the ink running in places, but the words still readable if you squinted. Cook needed. Black Pine Lodge. North Mountain Road. Mile marker, 34. No quitters. She crossed the street and pulled the notice off the post and read it 3 more times. Black Pine Lodge. She'd heard the name once, maybe twice, a remote shelter up in the mountains that served hunters and travelers and mountain workers, the kind of place you went when there was no other shelter, and the weather was coming down hard. No one from town went up there by choice. The road was brutal in good weather and nearly impassable once winter set in. She folded the notice and put it in her pocket. The man inside the trading post watched her from behind the window glass. She could see him, middle-aged, skeptical, already shaking his head, the way they all shook their heads. "You thinking about that notice?" he called out through the cracked door. "Yes, that's Ethan Walker's place. Man hasn't had a cook last more than 3 weeks in 2 years. Place is half falling apart and full of the roughest men you ever saw. No woman in her right mind would take that job." Clara looked at him. "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking your opinion," she said. She turned north and started walking. The road to Black Pine Lodge was not a road so much as a suggestion that something had once passed through the mountains in that general direction. Clara walked for 3 days. She slept one night under a rock overhang, with her coat pulled tight around her and her bag clutched in both arms, and she listened to the wind move through the pine trees and told herself she was not afraid. She was mostly telling the truth. The fear was there, but it was quiet underneath everything else. And what was louder was the thing she'd carried with her since the last morning she'd spent with her father, his voice saying, "Don't you let them take this from you, Clara. Don't you let one single person with a mean mouth decide what you're worth." Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had been the best baker in 3 counties for 30 years. He'd taught her everything: how to feel the humidity in the air and know how it would affect the dough, how to tell by smell alone when something was about to burn, how to make a meal from almost nothing that would still taste like something was made with love. He'd never once suggested that she was less than exactly right the way she was. He'd never said a word about her size or her shape or the way other people looked at her, except once near the end when he was very sick and his voice was thin and he'd taken her hand and said, "They will judge you, baby girl, because that's the cheapest thing people do. Don't you give it weight." He was gone 3 months after that. Pneumonia in February. She'd buried him herself because there wasn't money for anyone else to do it. And then she'd packed his rolling pin and his favorite paring knife and his handwritten recipe book into her bag. And she'd walked out of the only town she'd ever called home, because that town had never been home anyway. It had been her father's town. Without him, it was just a place full of people who looked at her sideways. She'd been moving ever since. On the second day of walking, she passed a group of hunters coming down from the mountain. 3 men on horseback with 2 pack mules loaded with gear. They slowed when they saw her. "You heading up?" one of them asked. He had a long beard and the particular squinting look of a man who spent most of his life outside. "Black Pine Lodge," she said. He and the other 2 exchanged a look. "On foot," the second man said. "My horse was unavailable," Clara said. The bearded man scratched his jaw. "Walker know you're coming." "I'm responding to his notice." Another look between them. The third man, who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward in his saddle. He was younger, maybe 20, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it was thinking. "You're going to cook up there," he said. He didn't say it mean exactly. He said it the way people said things when they were genuinely surprised and hadn't yet figured out whether they should hide it. "That's the plan," Clara said. The bearded man cleared his throat. "Last cook they had, big fella, spent 10 years cooking on trail drives, lasted 11 days. Said the place was too hard. I've heard worse descriptions. There's going to be 60 men up there come January, storm season. Then they're going to need someone who knows what they're doing." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly. Then he reached behind him and pulled something from his saddlebag, a cloth-wrapped package. "Venison jerky," he said. "You got another day of walking at least." Clara took it. "Thank you." "You got grit," he said. "I'll give you that." "I've got more than grit," she said. "I've got my father's recipes." He laughed at that, not a mean laugh, a real one. Then he clicked at his horse and rode on past her, and Clara watched him go, and then turned back to the mountain and kept walking. She smelled the lodge before she saw it, wood smoke, and beneath that the particular sour smell of a kitchen that hadn't been properly cleaned in too long, and under that something else, something organic and faintly wrong, the smell of food that had been handled carelessly. She filed that away. Black Pine Lodge appeared through the trees at mid-morning of her 3rd day. A long, low structure built from heavy timber, with a wide porch running the length of the front, and a stable off to one side, and 2 smaller outbuildings behind. It was bigger than she'd expected. It was also rougher. The porch railing was broken in 2 places. The sign above the door had lost a letter. 3 horses stood in the yard, in no particular relation to the hitching post. Smoke came from 2 chimneys, which meant the fire management was chaotic. A man came out of the stable before she'd gotten to the porch steps. He was tall, the kind of tall that meant he'd had to learn to move through doorways carefully, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been out in mountain weather for a long time. He was carrying a saddle over one arm, and he stopped when he saw her, and his face did not do any of the things men's faces usually did when they looked at her. It did not shift. It did not recalculate. It just waited. "You Ethan Walker?" Clara said. "I am," he said. "And you'd be Clara Whitmore. I'm here about the cook position." He looked at her bag. He looked at the rolled-up notice she still had in her coat pocket, the corner of it showing. He looked back at her face. "You came up from Durango?" "Yes." "On foot?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." He set the saddle down on the porch railing, which creaked under the weight, but held and crossed his arms. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't friendly either. He was the kind of man who had learned to hold everything at a distance until he understood what he was dealing with. "3 days on that road," he said. "Alone." "I'm aware of how long it took," Clara said. "I was there." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "You have cooking experience," he said. "I grew up in my father's bakery. I've cooked in trail camps in 2 hotel kitchens in a mining operation that fed 300 men a day. I know how to feed large numbers of people with limited supplies under bad conditions. I know how to manage provisions. I know how to stretch a larder. I know how to make men who are cold and exhausted and feeling sorry for themselves eat something hot and feel like they can face whatever comes next." She paused. "That's what you need up here, isn't it?" Ethan Walker looked at her for a long moment. "My last 3 cooks quit," he said. "I don't quit." "You don't know what you're signing on for." "Tell me, and we'll find out if it changes my answer." He unfolded his arms. He picked the saddle back up. He said, "Come inside. I'll show you the kitchen." Done. The kitchen was a disaster. That was the only word for it. The stove had a crack in the firebox that would compromise heat distribution. The work table was filthy in the specific way of a surface that had been cleaned around but never actually cleaned. The storage area was a system-less heap of sacks and tins and open containers with no organization and no logic to what had been used first. There was dried something she was not certain what on the ceiling near the stovepipe. Clara walked through it slowly, and Ethan Walker stood in the doorway and watched her. "The last man left 6 weeks ago," he said. "I've had the men take turns. They cook about as well as you'd expect." "What do you have for supplies?" He showed her. It was not encouraging. Flour not much. Dried beans. Salt pork, some of it questionable. Root vegetables. A small amount of lard. Coffee, thankfully. Some dried herbs that had lost most of their potency. 3 tins of something with the labels gone. "How many men are you feeding right now?" Clara asked. 24. "And by January. Could be 60. Could be more if the storms come early. Travelers, hunters, mountain workers who get trapped. This is the only shelter on the North Road." Clara opened one of the mystery tins. Tomatoes. She opened the second. Peaches. She opened the third. She smelled it carefully. Beans already cooked and still good. "I'll need supplies," she said. "I'll give you a list before the mountain road closes." "You haven't seen your room yet. Show me the stove first. I need to know how bad that crack is." He showed her. It was bad, but not unfixable. She'd worked with worse. There were some things she could do with it tonight, and some things that would need a proper repair from someone who knew metalwork. "You have a man who can do metalwork?" she asked. "Hobbs. He can fix most things if you explain what you need." "Good." She turned around and looked at him. "Here's what I need to know. The men who are here, are they going to give me trouble?" Ethan's face went still in a specific way. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind where they decide the cook's job isn't serious because of who's doing it." He held her gaze. "Some of them will try. Men up here have been a long time without much to look forward to, and they get stupid. Anyone steps out of line, I handle it. That's how this place runs." "I can handle myself," Clara said. "I don't doubt it," he said. "But I'm telling you how it is. My lodge, my rules, my people. You have a problem with one of my men, you come to me. Clara thought about that. It was not exactly the answer she'd wanted. She'd have preferred a more absolute guarantee. But there was something in his voice that was different from the usual dismissal she encountered. He wasn't saying the men's behavior was her problem to manage. He was saying it was his. "All right," she said. "Your room's off the back. Small, one window. You'll have privacy." "That'll do." "Supper's in 4 hours," he said. "The men are expecting whatever they've been getting, which is not much." Clara looked at the pitiful collection of supplies, at the cracked stove, at the disaster of a kitchen around her. "They'll get more than that," she said. Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded one short, economical nod and walked out. Clara tied on her apron. She rolled up her sleeves. She went to work. The stew she made that first night was, in all honesty, not her best work. She was working with bad equipment and depleted supplies and 3 hours of prep time in a kitchen she didn't know yet. But it was hot, and it was thick, and it was seasoned properly, and she'd managed to pull enough flavor out of what she had to make it taste like something. She'd baked a quick bread, not the bread she'd make when she had proper time and proper supplies, but real bread, not the gray, crumbling thing she'd found left over from whoever had cooked last. When the men came in for supper, they came in the way men always did in rough places, loud and hard and filling whatever space they occupied. They were hunters and mountain workers, and 2 men who looked like they'd been traveling for a while and had found their way here out of necessity. They were cold and tired, and not particularly cheerful. Several of them stopped when they smelled the stew. Clara stood behind the serving counter and kept her face neutral. The first one, through a big man with red-brown hair and a face like a fist, stopped and looked at her. Looked at her the way she'd been looked at her whole life. Then he looked at the stew. "Where's Peterson?" he said. "Peterson's gone," said the man behind him. "Who's this?" Clara met his eyes. "I'm the cook," she said. "You want supper, or you want to ask more questions?" The red-haired man blinked. Then he laughed, a big rolling laugh that the men behind him caught and spread around. Clara didn't move her face. "Well," he said, still laughing, "let's see what you got then." She filled his bowl. She filled every bowl. She watched them sit and eat, watched the laughter fade as they tasted the food, watched the particular silence that falls over hungry men when they're eating something real. The red-haired man, she would later learn his name was Griggs, finished his bowl and looked at it like he was surprised it was empty. "More," Clara said. He looked up at her. The laughing was gone. He wasn't apologetic. Men like Griggs didn't apologize, but something in his face had shifted. "Yeah," he said. "More." She filled it again. Ethan Walker sat at the end of the long table and ate his supper without speaking. Clara watched him from the kitchen doorway. He ate slowly and deliberately, and he finished every bite. Then he looked up and caught her watching him. He said nothing. She went back to washing the pots. She was still washing pots 2 hours later when she heard the door and turned to find Ethan Walker standing in the kitchen. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm not done. It'll be here in the morning." "I know it'll be here in the morning. I want to know what I'm starting with when I wake up." She scrubbed at a particularly stubborn pot. "The stove repair can't wait. I need Hobbs to look at that firebox first thing tomorrow, or I'll lose heat control when I'm trying to bake." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He picked up a rag without being asked and started drying the pots she'd already washed, which surprised her enough that she almost said something. "Where'd you cook before this?" he asked. "Mining camp in Nevada. Hotel kitchen in Santa Fe. My father's bakery before that." "How long since your father's bakery?" She paused. "Long enough." He dried 3 more pots. "The men were different tonight," he said. "At supper. Usually there's more trouble. The stew helped. Maybe." He hung the pot on its hook. "Griggs asked me after supper who you were." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were the cook. He said you had sharp eyes." "He's perceptive." Ethan looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, careful, measuring, but not hostile. Where'd you come from before Durango? Santa Fe. And before that? Does it matter? He considered this. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. He set down the rag. Hobbs will be at the stable at dawn. I'll tell him you need him in here first. Thank you. He was at the door when she said, Mr. Walker. He turned. The bread tomorrow will be better, she said. I need to know what you can get in supplies before the road closes. How long do we have? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Depends on the weather. I'll have you a list by tomorrow evening. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. Men like Ethan Walker, she was beginning to understand, had learned to keep whatever they were thinking deep down and out of sight, the way you kept a fire banked present, but not visible. All right, he said. He went out. Clara turned back to the pots. The list she gave him the next evening covered 2 pages written in her precise small handwriting, organized by category: dry goods, preserved meats, root vegetables, spices, salt lard, specialty items if available. She'd calculated portions for 60 people across 4 months, built in a 20% buffer for hard days, flagged 3 items as critical and 6 as important, and the rest as beneficial if possible. Ethan sat across the table from her in the lodge's main room and read through both pages without speaking. Clara watched his face. When he got to the total on the 2nd page, he looked up. This is a lot, he said. Yes. It's going to be expensive. More expensive than 60 men starving on your mountain. He looked at her, not offended, considering. Some of this. He pointed at the list. The spices, the specialty items. Those aren't necessities. They are if you want the men to stay sane through 3 months of hard winter, Clara said. A man who's eating the same bland meal 6 days out of 7 loses something that matters. He gets short-tempered and hopeless, and he starts making bad decisions. You add a little pepper, a little variation, something that reminds him there's a world outside the snow. It matters more than you think. Ethan looked at the list again. Your father teach you that. My father taught me that food is the first thing. Before warmth, before shelter, before anything else, a man needs to feel like there's something worth eating. That's when he knows he's still human. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like something breathing. I'll get what's on here, he said. All of it. All of it. Clara had not expected that. She'd been prepared to argue for the critical items and negotiate for the rest. She sat with the surprise for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me if it works. Chad. Nathan Caldwell arrived at the lodge on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Clara had taken up the cook's position, and the moment she saw him through the kitchen window, she understood something she hadn't known she was going to understand. He was dressed too well for a mountain lodge pressed coat, clean hat boots that had never seen real mud. He arrived with 2 men who stood behind him like decorations. He had the face of a man who had been told yes his entire life, and had built a personality around that experience. Ethan met him on the porch. Clara stayed in the kitchen, but she could hear through the window she'd cracked open for ventilation. Walker, Nathan Caldwell said, and his voice was the kind of smooth that meant he practiced it. I'm here to make another offer on the lodge. Answer's still no, Ethan said. The answer was no in March. It was no in July. It's been no every time we've had this conversation. Caldwell's voice stayed pleasant. But I want you to consider that the winter's coming, your supply situation is complicated, and a man in your position might want to think seriously about liquidity. My position's fine, Ethan said. Is it? I heard your last cook quit. I heard you've been feeding men on scraps for 6 weeks. A pause. I also heard you hired someone new. That true? That's not your business. Everything on this mountain is my business. Something shifted in Caldwell's voice, still smooth, but with something under it, like rock under shallow water. The supply routes run through my territory, Walker. The men you're hiring come from my contacts. When I decide something isn't my business, that's when it isn't." Clara was still. She was standing at the work table with a knife in her hand and a pile of vegetables in front of her, and she had gone very still. "You came to make an offer," Ethan said. His voice was flat. "I've heard it. Answer's no. You can leave or you can get off your horse and come eat breakfast. That's your choice." Caldwell laughed. It was a practiced laugh. "Who's cooking breakfast?" "My cook." Caldwell swung down from his horse. He walked up onto the porch with his 2 men behind him, and Clara heard his footsteps come through the lodge and stop in the kitchen doorway. She kept her eyes on the vegetables. "You're the new cook," he said. "That's right," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was looking at her the way Nathan Caldwell looked at everything, calculating, dismissive. Certain he already understood the full value and worth of whatever was in front of him. "How interesting," he said. "Breakfast is in an hour," Clara said. "You're welcome to it." "Walker always did have unusual taste," Caldwell said. He said it like it was a joke, the kind of joke that's meant to wound, but wrap itself in plausibility, so the person who makes it can claim they meant nothing by it. Clara set down the knife. She turned around fully and looked at him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I don't know you. You don't know me. But I know what kind of man walks into a working kitchen and says that kind of thing to the person who's standing in it." She picked up the knife again. "You're welcome to breakfast. You're not welcome to make this kitchen smaller than it is." Caldwell's face went very still. Behind him, one of his men shifted his weight. Then Caldwell smiled the slow, certain smile of a man who has decided to wait. "Sharp tongue," he said. "Sharp knife, too," Clara said pleasantly. "Breakfast is in an hour." He left. Ethan Walker appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later. "You heard that," Clara said. "Enough of it." "He wants the lodge. He's wanted it for 3 years. He's going to be a problem," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "He already is one. Has been. I manage it. He controls the supply routes. Some of them, not all. Then we need to make sure the supplies on that list come up before he can do anything about it." She was already moving, already thinking through it. "Can you go around his routes?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You think like a man who's had enemies before?" he said. "I think like a woman who's had to solve her own problems," she said. "Can you go around his routes?" "Yeah," he said slowly. "I can go around." "Then do it soon," she said. "He's going to move faster than you think." Outside, she heard Caldwell's horse leaving. She went back to her vegetables. She could feel Ethan Walker still standing in the doorway watching her in that careful, considering way he had the way of a man relearning whether to trust his own judgment. She didn't say anything else. There was breakfast to make, and 60 people by January, and a mountain winter coming down fast, and a man with smooth shoes who was going to try to take all of it apart. Clara Whitmore had 17 cents and a rolling pin and her father's voice in her chest. She intended to be ready for every single thing that came next. Breakfast the next morning was the first real test. Clara had been up before the sky showed any light at all, working the stove while the fire was still finding itself, and she'd done what she could with what she had: proper scrambled eggs with dried herbs, pan biscuits that were golden and not gray, and a pot of gravy made from the drippings of the previous night's meat that she'd saved specifically for this purpose. She'd also put on a second pot of coffee, stronger than what the men had been getting, because she'd noticed the night before that the coffee was weak, and that weak coffee in a cold place was a small cruelty. Griggs came in first again because Griggs was always first, and he stopped when he smelled the gravy. "That's biscuits and gravy," he said to nobody in particular. "Sharp eyes and a sharp nose," Clara said. "Sit down." He sat. He didn't say anything else until she put the plate in front of him, and then he was quiet for a different reason. The reason of a man who is tasting something and doesn't want to stop to speak. 2 more men came in behind him, then 4 more. Then the room filled up the way it always did, loud and cold-breathed and boot-heavy. And then it got quiet in that way Clara had already started to recognize, the particular quiet of men who were eating real food and remembering what that felt like. She watched from the kitchen doorway. She cataloged faces. She was already learning which men would give her trouble, and which ones would give her loyalty, and which ones were somewhere in the middle capable of going either way, depending on which direction the wind was blowing. The man in the middle of the table, she'd learned his name was Doyle, a trapper who'd been working the mountain for 15 years and commanded a kind of unofficial respect from the others, looked up from his plate and found her eyes and gave her a single nod. Not friendly exactly. Not unfriendly. The nod of a man who was revising a judgment. She nodded back. Then the door opened and a man came in that she hadn't seen before. Younger, maybe 22, with a disorganized look about him, like all his parts had grown at different rates and hadn't quite settled into agreement. He sat at the far end of the table and looked at the food, and then looked at Clara, and then looked at Griggs. "Who cooked?" he said. "New cook," Griggs said, mouth still full. "When do we get a new cook?" "Few days ago." The young man looked at Clara again. Not with meanness, with the unfiltered curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise his reactions. "You came up from Durango," he said. "I did," Clara said. "By yourself." "By myself." He thought about this for a moment. "That's 3 days on foot," he said. "In October." "I'm aware." He was quiet. Then, "The biscuits are real good, ma'am." "Thank you," Clara said. "What's your name?" "Tommy," he said. "Tommy Hatch. Eat your breakfast, Tommy." He ate his breakfast, and something in the room shifted, small, almost invisible, but Clara felt it the way she felt changes in dough, that particular loosening of something that had been too tight. She went back to the stove and let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she started planning lunch. It was Hobbs who fixed the stove, and Hobbs who became her first real ally in the lodge, though neither of them would have used that word for it. He was a compact, quiet man, maybe 50, with hands that were more scar than skin, and the kind of patience that came from spending a life fixing things that other people had broken. He'd listened to her explanation of the firebox problem without interrupting, which already put him above most of the men she'd dealt with in her working life, and then he'd crouched down and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then looked up at her. "You know a lot about stoves," he said. "I know a lot about what happens when a stove doesn't work right," she said. He almost smiled. "I can fix this," he said. "Take me most of the morning. I've got the fire in the small cook stove out back. I can work around you." "Appreciate that." He paused. He was still crouching by the stove, running his fingers along the crack, with the careful attention of someone reading something written in a language they knew very well. "You staying?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "The last few. They didn't stay. Said the place was too hard." He looked up at her. "You planning on staying?" "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her for another moment. "Good," he said. And that was all he said, and he went to work on the stove. By noon, the firebox was repaired, and Clara had moved her operation back to the main stove, and by the time supper came around, she had proper heat for the first time, and the difference in the cooking was immediate. She could feel it. Could feel the way the heat distributed evenly now, the way the bread rose, the way it was supposed to rise. When she set the supper bread on the table that night, real bread, the bread she could make when she had time and proper equipment, the room went quiet in a new way. Doyle picked up a piece. He looked at it. He looked at her. "My mother made bread like this," he said. "What kind?" Clara asked. "Prairie bread. She'd put a little honey in when she had it." "I can do that," Clara said. Doyle looked at the bread for another moment. Then he put it in his mouth, and something moved across his weathered face. Something private and old, and not entirely without pain. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. That night, when Clara was cleaning up, she heard Griggs and Doyle talking on the other side of the kitchen wall, their voices low and rumbling. "She's something," Griggs said. "She's good," Doyle said. "Real good." "Think she'll stay?" "I think," Doyle said slowly, "that she came up that mountain by herself in October and didn't blink. So yeah, I think she'll stay. Clara kept washing the pots. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt something more complicated than that, something like the cautious relief of a person who has survived the first stage of something, and is wise enough to know there are more stages coming. The supplies came up on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Clara had handed Ethan her list, and it was the most she had felt like herself since her father died. 4 wagons. Everything on the list. Every single item, including the specialty spices, and the extra salt, and the 2 crates of apples she'd requested, because apples lasted through winter if you stored them right, and they were the difference between men who still had something to look forward to at the end of a hard day, and men who'd lost hope. Ethan had gone around Caldwell's routes entirely. She didn't ask how, and he didn't say, and the supplies were up and stored, before Caldwell likely even knew they were moving. Clara spent an entire day organizing the storage area. She built a system categories rotation labeling priority access for what would be used most frequently and protected storage for what had to last. She brought Tommy Hatch in and taught him the system, because he was willing to learn, and because she needed someone who could maintain it when she wasn't there. "Why does it have to be in this order?" Tommy asked, eyeing the carefully arranged rows of sacks. "Because in February, when we're low on everything, and we need to find the last of the dried beans fast, you don't want to be digging through a pile," Clara said. "Everything in the right place means you can find anything in the dark." Tommy thought about this. "That's smart," he said with the guileless frankness of someone who said what he thought. "Thank you, Tommy. My ma organized the pantry like that," he said. "She used to say—" He stopped. Clara looked at him. The disorganized young face had gone somewhere else for a moment. "What did she say?" Clara asked. "She said a kitchen was the heart of a house," Tommy said. "And if the heart was a mess, everything else would be too." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. He picked up a sack and placed it exactly where she'd shown him. "She passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "You lose yours?" "My father, last spring." Tommy nodded. He kept placing sacks with the careful focus of someone who'd decided that keeping his hands busy was the best way to hold something difficult at a distance. "He teach you to cook?" he asked. "Everything I know," Clara said. "That's something," Tommy said. "That's a real thing to leave someone." Clara turned back to her work before he could see her face. It was Doyle who warned her. He came into the kitchen on a Friday morning 12 days after the supplies arrived, and he waited until the other men had gone out, and then he closed the door behind him and stood there with his hat in his hands. "Caldwell was at the trapper's post last night," he said. Clara kept her hands moving. "What was he doing there? Talking? Buying drinks? The kind of talking and buying drinks that means something's getting arranged." Doyle turned his hat in his hands. "He said some things about the lodge, about Walker, and about you." She looked up. "What about me?" "He said Walker had hired someone unsuitable for the position. Said it was evidence that Walker was losing his judgment. Said a lodge that couldn't even find a proper cook was a lodge that was failing." He paused. He said it in front of the magistrate. Clara set down what she was holding. The magistrate was there. "Henderson. He and Caldwell play cards on Fridays. Have for years." Doyle's expression was steady but serious. "Henderson's not corrupt far as I know, but he listens to Caldwell. Everybody up here does one way or another. Caldwell's got money, and Caldwell's got reach, and when a man's got both of those, he can make things happen that don't look like anything he did." "What is he trying to do?" Clara said, though she already half knew. "Make Walker look incompetent. Get enough doubt in the right ears so that if anything goes wrong up here this winter, it looks like mismanagement." Doyle looked at her directly. "And the thing is, he said something specific. He said the cook situation was he used the word embarrassing. That's the word he used." Clara was quiet. "I thought you should know," Doyle said. "Does Walker know?" "I'm telling you first." She thought about that. "Why me first?" Doyle looked at his hat. then back at her. Because Walker's going to want to go down there and make it a physical problem. And that's what Caldwell wants. He paused. You seem like someone who solves things a different way. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Doyle was 15 years in the mountains, a man who had survived a long time by reading things correctly. She took that seriously. Thank you, she said. I mean it. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He went to the door. Doyle, she said. He turned. The bread tomorrow. I'm making your mother's kind. I found a little honey in the supplies. Something moved across his face, fast and private, but real. Appreciate that, he said. His voice was a little rougher than it had been. He went out. She told Ethan that night. He was in the main room going over the supply ledger, which he did every evening with the focused attention of a man who managed a thing by knowing it exactly down to the last number. She came and sat across from him and waited until he looked up. Caldwell was at the trapper's post, she said, with Henderson. Ethan's face went very still. He's framing you, Clara said. Not attacking directly. He's putting a story in place. Bad management, questionable judgment, so that when something goes wrong this winter, and something always goes wrong that's winter, he's already built the context for it to look like your failure. Ethan looked at her. Doyle told you. Yes. Doyle came to you instead of me. Yes. A pause. The fire cracked. Wind moved outside. You're not going to like why, Clara said. Tell me anyway. He thought you'd go down there and do something physical. He thought I'd find another way. Ethan was quiet. His jaw was doing something controlled and careful. She could see the temper under the surface, not a loose temper, not the kind that exploded without direction, but the cold, targeted kind that was actually harder to manage. He's not wrong, Ethan said finally. No, Clara agreed. He's not. So what's the other way? We don't give him anything to point at, she said. We make this lodge so undeniably functional, so obviously well-run, that any story he tries to tell about mismanagement looks ridiculous. The food, the supplies, the organization, the way the men are. She leaned forward. When the first bad storm comes, and 60 people end up sheltering here, and every one of them gets fed properly and housed properly and treated like human beings, that's your answer to Caldwell, not a fist. Ethan looked at her across the table. You think that's enough, he said. I think it has to be, she said, because the other option hands him what he wants. The fire shifted. Ethan looked down at the ledger. He put his pencil down, and he was quiet for a long time. My father built this lodge, he said. Clara waited. 40 years ago, he was 23. Came up this mountain with $12 and a mule, and he built this place because there was nothing between here and the pass, and people were dying in the winters trying to make that crossing without shelter. He looked at the table. He ran it for 30 years. When he died, he left it to me. What happened to your father? Heart gave out. He was 60. He'd run this place through blizzards and rock slides and 2 fires, and one man tried to burn it down deliberately once about 15 years back. He handled all of it. A pause. He used to say this lodge wasn't about him. It was about the people who needed it. Clara looked at him. The careful armored man across the table from her had opened something up just a fraction, the way a door opens enough to show light through the crack. That's why you won't sell, she said. That's why I won't sell. Then we protect it the way your father protected it, Clara said. Not with fists, with the thing it's for. Ethan looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but moved. Like something that had been set in a fixed position for a very long time had just slightly changed its angle. All right, he said. He picked up his pencil and went back to the ledger. Clara went back to the kitchen. But something had changed between them, not large, not declared, but present. The way a thing becomes true before anyone has said it out loud. The first snow came 2 days later. Not the killing snow, not yet. Just the first real snow of the season, the kind that announced itself seriously and meant business and showed you what was coming. It came in the night, and by morning the world outside the lodge was white, and the temperature had dropped hard. Clara was at the stove before anyone else was awake. She'd been thinking about this for days, the first cold morning of real winter. What the men would need, what it would cost psychologically to walk out into that cold on an empty stomach versus walking out fed properly. She'd planned the breakfast specifically. She had a pot of porridge going with dried fruit and a touch of the precious honey, and she had thick slabs of bread toasting on the stovetop, and she had the coffee stronger than it had ever been, and she had a second thing going. A surprise, a small one, but real. When the men came down and smelled it, they stopped in the doorway, the same way men stop when they're not sure if what they're experiencing is real. "Is that?" Griggs started. "Fried apples," Clara said. "Sit down." She'd taken some of the stored apples and sliced and fried them in a little lard with cinnamon, and the last of a small bit of maple sugar she'd squirreled away for exactly this purpose. It was not an expensive dish. It was not complicated. But in a mountain lodge on the first real day of winter, with the cold pressing against every wall, it was the kind of thing that made men feel like the world was still a place worth being in. Griggs sat down. He ate the fried apples with the porridge and the toast, and he didn't say a single word, which was its own kind of loud. Tommy Hatch came in last, stamping snow off his boots, and he stopped when he saw the food, and his whole face changed. "My ma used to make fried apples," he said. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. "You told me," she said. "Last week. Sit down, Tommy." He sat. He ate. He was very quiet for a boy who was usually talking. Ethan Walker came in and got his food without ceremony and sat at the end of the table. Clara brought him coffee. When she set it down, he looked up at her. "You planned this," he said, quiet enough that no one else could hear. "First, snow matters," she said. "Psychologically. Sets the tone for the whole winter." He looked at his coffee, then at the room full of men who were eating with the focused attention of people receiving something they hadn't expected. "You see things," he said. "I've been in hard places before," Clara said. "I know what people need." He looked at her for a moment. "What did you need," he said, "when you were in the hard places?" She hadn't expected that. She picked up the empty coffee pot and held it in both hands and looked at him. "Someone to see me," she said. "Instead of everything they assumed about me." Ethan Walker held her gaze. His expression was the most open she'd seen. It's still careful, still guarded, but open. The way a man's face looks when he's just recognized something he's been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. "I see you, Clara," he said. She stood there for one full second. Then she went back to the kitchen. Caldwell came back on the day when the snow had settled into a steady, cold purpose, and this time he didn't come alone. He brought Henderson. The magistrate was a compact, gray-haired man with a careful manner and the look of someone who navigated everything by not committing to anything until the very last moment. He came inside and looked around the lodge with the specific attention of someone who was being asked to form an opinion. Caldwell was already talking before he was fully through the door. "You can see for yourself," Caldwell was saying to Henderson. "The whole operation as well, it speaks for itself." The lodge was full of men eating lunch. Clara had made a white bean soup with the salt pork and some of the dried herbs that had recovered some potency since she'd stored them properly, and she'd made cornbread from the good cornmeal in the supplies. The room was warm. The men were settled. It looked, Clara knew, like exactly what it was, a functioning, well-run lodge where people were being taken care of properly. Henderson looked around. His face was neutral. Caldwell looked around too, and she could see him recalculating. This was not what he'd expected. Not the chaos and deterioration his story required. "Walker," Caldwell said, recovering smoothly. "I brought Mr. Henderson up to have a look at the place. He has some questions about the winter operations." "Happy to answer them," Ethan said. "Your supply situation," Henderson said. He had a precise, careful voice. "I've heard some concern that—" "We're fully provisioned," Ethan said. "Enough for 4 months, More if we're careful. Henderson looked at the room, at the food, at the men eating it. Then he looked at Clara. "You're the cook," he said. "Yes, sir," Clara said. "How long have you been here?" "About a month." Henderson looked at the food again. "This is your doing." "The food, yes. Mr. Walker got the supplies up before the road closed, which was the critical piece. I just made sure we used them right." Henderson was quiet. He was doing math. Clara could see it. He was revising something. Caldwell's smooth voice came in. "It's admirable," he said in the tone of a man setting a trap in a sentence, to see Walker making do with whatever he could find on short notice. "But a lodge of this importance in a winter of this severity." "Mr. Caldwell," Clara said. He stopped. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is surprised to have been interrupted by someone he'd categorized as beneath interrupting. "These men are well fed," Clara said. "The lodge is properly provisioned. The kitchen is organized and functional. Mr. Walker has done everything that should be done to prepare for winter." She held his eyes. "If you have a specific concern about the operations here, I'm happy to walk Mr. Henderson through the storage inventory and the meal planning and the provision rotation so he can see exactly what the situation is." She said it pleasantly. She said it with the voice she used when she was being very controlled. Henderson looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face moved, something like reassessment or respect, or both. "I'd appreciate that," Henderson said, "if you have time." "I have time right now," Clara said. She walked Henderson through the storage area herself. Every label, every number, every category. She showed him the rotation system, the priority reserves, the buffer she'd built in for hard days. She showed him the meal plan, not written out but in her head, and she spoke it out clearly, and Henderson wrote some things in his notebook and asked 2 questions. That were good questions. The questions of a man who actually wanted to understand what he was looking at. When they came back to the main room, Caldwell was standing by the fire looking polished and patient. "Impressive," Henderson said to Ethan. Not to Caldwell, to Ethan. "I don't have any concerns about the winter operations." Caldwell's face stayed smooth, but something behind his eyes went cold. "Of course," he said. "I only wanted to make sure everything was in order." He turned to Clara and smiled. "You've done well," he said. "For someone in your position." Clara looked at him. She knew exactly what he meant, and he knew she knew. The smile was the point, the smile and the particular weight of, "for someone in your position," the way it was designed to diminish without saying the diminishing thing directly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not. "We'll see you in the spring, Mr. Caldwell." Henderson shook Ethan's hand. They left. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched them go, and then he turned around and looked at Clara, and in his face she saw something she hadn't seen before, something that was not just respect, which he'd shown her from early on, but something warmer than that. Something a man showed when someone had just done something for him that he would have found very hard to do for himself. "You were something just now," he said. "I was just telling the truth," Clara said. "There's a way of telling the truth that puts a man like Caldwell in a box he can't get out of without looking like what he is," Ethan said. "That's not just truth-telling." Clara looked at him. "He's not done," she said. "No. He's going to come at us from a different direction." "Yes. Then we'd better be ready." Ethan looked at her. The light in the lodge was the warm gold of afternoon through small windows, and it fell across his face and showed all the years in it, the hard years, the isolated years, the years of a man who had kept people at a distance long enough that the distance had started to feel like the only safe thing. "Ready seems to be your natural state," he said. Clara looked away first. She went back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Griggs say something to Doyle too low to catch. She heard Doyle's short, graveled laugh. She heard Tommy Hatch ask someone to pass the cornbread. She stood at the work table and put her hands on its surface and breathed. The lodge was warm and loud and real around her, and outside the mountain, winter was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and certain. She was not 17 cents and a rolling pin anymore. She was not the woman standing outside a closed door. She was here. This kitchen was hers. These men were hers to feed and look after and hold together. This lodge was worth protecting, and she was going to protect it. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet but present, was the knowledge that Ethan Walker had looked at her tonight and said, "I see you, Clara." She held that carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you don't yet fully trust yourself to carry. Then she started planning tomorrow's breakfast, because the mountain was coming down hard outside, and 60 people were counting on her hands, and Clara Whitmore had never in her life let anyone go hungry when she could do something about it. The snow that came the third week of November was not like the first snow. The first snow had been a warning. This one was a verdict. It came in from the northwest in the early hours before dawn, and by the time Clara had the stove going and the first pot of coffee on, she could hear it, not see it, hear it the way the wind had changed pitch and the way the lodge walls were doing something they hadn't done before. A low, sustained pressure sound, like the building was being tested by something that meant it. Ethan was already up. She heard him moving in the main room before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, heard him talking in a low voice to Doyle, heard the specific, careful tone of two men who had seen bad weather before and were deciding how bad this was. She went to the doorway. "How long?" she asked. Ethan looked at her. "Doyle thinks 3 days, maybe 4. "How many people do we have?" 41 as of last night. 3 more came in around midnight. Trappers caught out when it shifted. 44 people. Clara did the math in her head the way she always did, automatically, the way her father had taught her, provisions against people, against days, with a buffer for the days that were harder than expected, which in her experience was most of them. "We're all right," she said. "If it's 4 days? And if it's longer?" She looked at him. "Then we get creative, but we're all right for 4 days." Ethan held her gaze for a moment, and in his eyes, she saw the thing she'd been watching grow in him over the past weeks. Not dependence. Nothing that simple, but something more like what happens when a man who has carried everything alone for a very long time starts to understand what it feels like to have someone to carry it with. "All right," he said. She went back to the kitchen and started calculating breakfast. The men who came down that morning were quieter than usual. The sound of the storm outside did something to people, not panic, not in men this experienced, but a drawing inward. A recalibration, the instinctive human response to being reminded that the world was larger and colder and less interested in their survival than they were. Clara had made a hot grain porridge with dried fruit, and she'd put out the bread from the night before. Still good. And the coffee was strong and hot, and she'd added a small splash of molasses to the pot, which gave it a depth and sweetness that the men wouldn't be able to name, but would feel in their chests. Grigg sat down and wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the storm-dark window, and then looked at Clara. "You worried?" he said. "No," Clara said. 4 days of this maybe. "I know, we have food for 8. Sit down and eat, Griggs." He ate. And something in the way she'd said it, not dismissively, not falsely cheerful, but flat and certain and real, moved through the room, the way things move through rooms when the right person says the right thing. She saw shoulders drop half an inch. She saw men pick up their spoons with a little more ease. Tommy Hatch came down last, which was unusual, and his face was pale. "You all right?" Clara said. "I hate storms," he said. He said it simply, without embarrassment, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about Tommy. He hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of what he felt. "I know," she said, because she did know she'd seen it in the way he'd been moving for the past 2 days, the restlessness of someone who felt the weather coming in his body. "Come have breakfast." He sat. He ate. And slowly the color came back into his face. The way warmth always moved through a person from the inside out when you fed them something real. The storm settled in like it planned to stay. By mid-morning, there were 2 more people at the door, a husband and wife travelers who'd been caught on the mountain road, the woman with frost on her coat, and her eyes showing the particular blankness of a person who has been very cold for too long. Clara had her in front of the kitchen stove with a blanket and a bowl of hot soup in under 4 minutes, and she watched the woman's hands shake around the bowl and then slowly steady. And the woman looked up at her with the dazed, grateful look of someone who had not expected kindness. "Thank you," the woman said. Her name was May. She was maybe 40 with a practical face and hands that said she worked hard for her living. "I didn't think we were going to make it." "You made it," Clara said. "Drink the soup." May drank the soup. Her husband, a quiet man named Robert, sat across from her and watched his wife with the tight-jawed relief of a man who had been very frightened and was only now beginning to let himself know it. "How long have you been on the road?" Clara asked. 2 days, Robert said. "We didn't know the storm was coming this fast." "Nobody did," Clara said. "You're safe now, both of you." Robert looked at her. He looked at the kitchen around them, organized, functional, warm, the smell of the soup and the bread and the coffee all layered together. He looked like a man revising his understanding of where he was. "This is some place," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." Yeah. By the afternoon of the second day, there were 53 people in the lodge, and Clara was running 4 pots simultaneously and had Tommy Hatch and a young trapper named Sears working the kitchen with her, and the 3 of them had developed a rhythm that was almost choreographic move here. "Hand me that watch, the heat on the left burner. The bread is ready." Griggs appeared in the kitchen doorway mid-afternoon with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "There's a problem," he said. She didn't stop moving. "What kind?" "Harmon." She looked up. Harmon was one of the older mountain workers, a big man with a bad temper that the cold made worse. She'd been watching him for days. "What did he do?" "He and 2 others have been taking extra from the storage," Griggs said. "I saw it, just now." Clara set down what she was holding. She looked at Tommy and Sears. "Keep the soup from scorching," she said. "I'll be back." She went to the storage room. Harmon was there with 2 men she knew, less well. Brothers came in with the second wave of hunters had been civil enough, but watchful in a way that put her on edge. They had a sack open, and they were helping themselves, and they didn't look surprised to see her, which meant they'd decided she wasn't worth worrying about. "Put it back," Clara said. Harmon looked at her. He was a head taller than her and twice as broad, and he'd spent enough years in rough places that he'd gotten comfortable with making smaller people feel the weight of that. "We're just taking what we're owed," he said. "You're taking what 53 other people are owed," Clara said. "Put it back." "There's plenty," one of the brothers said. "There is right now," Clara said. "There won't be if everyone decides to take what they want when they want it. This system works because everyone uses it right. You put that back, or you explain to the 43 men in the next room why they might run short in 10 days. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. She held his eyes, and she didn't move. She was aware that he could pick her up and move her out of the way without much effort, and she was aware that he knew she knew it, and she held his eyes anyway, because the only thing worth more than physical size in a standoff like this was the willingness to stand there. "Lady," Harmon started. "Miss Whitmore," she said, and put it back. The door opened behind her. Ethan Walker stepped in. He didn't say anything. He looked at the open sack at the brothers at Harmon at Clara. He took in the whole picture in about 2 seconds. "Problem," he said. His voice was very quiet. "No problem," Clara said, still looking at Harmon. "These men were returning something they'd accidentally taken. Isn't that right, Harmon?" A very long beat. Harmon looked at Ethan, then back at Clara. Something moved across his face, calculation, and then something more complicated. The thing that happens when a man reassesses who exactly he's standing in front of. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." He put the sack back. The brothers put back what they were holding. They went out past Ethan without looking at him. When they were gone, Ethan looked at Clara. "You handled that," he said. "Almost," she said. Your timing was good. Would you have needed me if I hadn't come? She looked at the replaced sack, looked back at him. Probably not, she said honestly. But I was glad you did. Something in his face moved the smallest thing, a relaxing of something that was always held tight. He held the door for her, and she went back to the kitchen, and behind her she heard him moving to have a very quiet and very specific conversation with Harmon, and she let him have it, because some things needed to be said between men, and she had soup to keep from scorching. The twist came on the morning of the third day, and it came from a direction nobody had looked. Clara was in the storage room doing her morning check. She did this every morning without fail, counting and recording, because the only way to manage limited resources was to know exactly what you had at every moment when she saw it. The flour sacks were wrong, not missing, not reduced in the ordinary way of being used, wrong in a different way, the way things are wrong when someone has gotten to them before you. She opened the nearest sack, reached in, pulled out a handful. The flour was wet. Not soaked, not sitting in water, but damp in the deep interior way that meant it had been exposed to moisture deliberately, and then resealed. She opened the second sack. Same. The third. Same. She went through every flour sack in the storage area, and they were all compromised, every single one, not unusable today, but in 48 hours they would be, and flour was the thing. Everything else was built on the bread, and the biscuits, and the thickening for the soups, and the binding for everything that held the meals together through a 4-month winter. She stood in the storage room with damp flour on her hands, and she was very, very still. Someone had come in here, not to take things to ruin them. Not Harmon, because Harmon was stupid, and what he'd done was stupid greedy, and this was something else. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was someone who understood exactly how to hurt a kitchen operation and had gone straight for the thing that would do the most damage on the longest timeline. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the main room. She came to him and she said low and direct, "Storage room. Now." He read her face, and he came without asking questions, which she appreciated. She showed him. He looked at the flour. He looked at her. He looked at the flour again. "All of it," he said. "Every sack." "How long do we have?" 48 hours before it's completely unusable. Maybe 60 if I work with the least damaged ones first." "How much bread can you get out of it before it goes?" "Enough for 2 days. After that, we're on grain and preserved food only." She paused. "Which we can manage, but just barely, and it will be felt." Ethan looked at the sacks. His jaw was doing the controlled thing. "Caldwell wasn't here," he said. "No, but someone who works for him was." "You're sure?" "Harmon was a distraction," Clara said. "I think he was paid to be one, to get our attention to the front while someone came in the back." She looked at him. "Does Harmon have a connection to Caldwell's operation?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "His brother-in-law drives one of Caldwell's supply wagons." The pieces of it clicked into place with the particular nauseating clarity of something that had been designed carefully. "He came here specifically to make trouble," Clara said. "And then someone else came in while we were dealing with it." "Who had access to this room?" Ethan said. "Anyone who knew the layout. The brothers who came in with Harmon. Anyone Caldwell could have placed in the group before the storm." Ethan looked at the ruined flour sacks. She could see the anger in him, cold and focused, and looking for something to do. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." "Clara." "He wants you to ride down that mountain in a blizzard and do something rash," she said. "He wants you frozen or arrested or both. And even if neither of those things happens, he wants you away from here while we're managing this." Ethan breathed. It was a controlled breath, the kind a man takes when the anger is bigger than the breath, but the breath is all he has. "Then what?" he said. "We fix it," she said. "We work with what we have. And we find out who in that main room doesn't belong there." She told no one else about the flour. She told Tommy to come to her before going to the storage for anything, and she watched his face to see if he already knew, and she was relieved to see that he clearly didn't. She told Sears the same thing, and watched the same thing. She went through the rest of the storage carefully, and found nothing else compromised. They'd gone for the most critical item, and done it surgically, which told her something about who had planned it. She started using the flour immediately, working through the least damaged sacks first, baking every possible thing she could get out of it. She worked in the small hours before the lodge woke up. She worked during the afternoon lull. She worked after supper, when the kitchen was quiet. She built up a reserve of baked bread that she stored carefully in the dry part of the storage area, enough to buy them another day, beyond what she'd originally calculated. On the afternoon of the third day, she found Ethan watching her from the kitchen doorway. "You've been awake since before the storm," he said. "I'm fine." "Clara." She looked up. His voice had a different quality to it when he said her name. Not always, but sometimes, like right now, and she'd started noticing it the way you notice a sound you can't quite place, but that you know you've heard before. "I'm fine," she said again. "How long can you keep this up?" "As long as it takes." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now." He came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the work table. He looked at what she was doing, the dough, the organization of it, the economy of her movements, everything built for efficiency, and nothing wasted. "Tell me what to do," he said. She looked at him. Ethan Walker, who ran everything himself, who had managed this lodge for years without asking anyone for help, was standing in her kitchen with his sleeves already rolled and the particular look of a man who has decided to do something unfamiliar. "You know how to knead bread?" she asked. "No." "I'll show you." She showed him. He was not good at it. His hands were too strong and too impatient. At first too much force and not enough feel, but he listened when she corrected him, and he adjusted, and after 20 minutes, he had something that was not graceful, but was functional, and she moved him to the next stage, while she handled the more precise work. They worked together in silence for a while. Just the sounds of the kitchen, and the storm outside, and the muffled noise of 53 people in the room beyond the wall. "My wife used to bake bread," Ethan said. He said it quietly, like he was saying it to the dough. Clara didn't say anything. She'd wondered. She'd seen the signs of someone who had built walls specifically around a particular loss. "She was good at it," he said. "Better than me. Better than most people." A pause. "She died 4 years ago. Fever in August. Fast." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "She would have—" He stopped. She was the kind of person who would have known what to do in a situation like this. She always knew what to do. His hands slowed on the dough. "I didn't know what to do after she was gone. I just kept running the lodge because it was what I had." Clara looked at him, the big, careful, armored man standing in her kitchen, talking to bread dough about the person he'd lost, and the raw truth of it was something she hadn't been prepared for. "That's what we do," she said quietly. "We keep moving because the moving is all we know how to do." He looked up at her. "Your father," he said. "Yes." "How long?" 7 months. 7. He held her gaze. And, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the storm pressing down on the lodge from outside, and 53 people, depending on both of them, something passed between them that didn't have a name, but was entirely real. The particular recognition between two people who have carried grief the same way, not dramatically, not with collapse, but forward and forward and forward, one day at a time, because there was always someone who needed feeding or protecting or holding together, and you couldn't do any of that lying down. "She would have liked you," Ethan said. "My wife. She would have liked you a great deal." Clara looked back at the bread. "That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time," she said. He was quiet. Then, "That shouldn't be true." "No," she agreed. "But it is." They kept working, and the storm kept coming down. And she found the saboteur on the evening of the third day, And it happened the way things happened in a lodge full of people sideways when nobody was looking for it. She'd sent Tommy to the storage room for salt, and he'd come back pale. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "there's someone in the storage room." She went. She went fast and quiet and without announcing herself, and she found a man she knew only as Belk, one of the group that had come in with the second wave, a quiet man who'd stayed quiet and given her no reason to watch him closely, which in retrospect was itself a reason, crouched by the remaining grain sacks with a flask in his hand. A flask that smelled even from the doorway like water. "Stop," Clara said. He moved faster than she expected, twisting and coming upright and going for the door. But Tommy was in the doorway. Tommy, who was young and quick, and who had understood immediately from Clara's face what was happening. And Belk ran directly into Tommy, and they went down together, and it was ugly and brief, and ended with Belk on the floor, and Tommy sitting on him with the expression of a young man who was deeply surprised by his own capability. "Tommy," Clara said. "I got him," Tommy said, slightly breathless. "I can see that. Don't let go." "I won't." She went and got Ethan. Ethan came in and looked at Belk on the floor, and Tommy on top of him, and the flask of water by the grain sacks, and his face went through about 4 things in 2 seconds, and landed on the cold and focused thing. "Where does Caldwell know you from?" Ethan said. Belk said nothing. "He'll just wait," Clara said to Belk. "He's good at that." "Are you?" Belk looked at her. He was a man who'd been very still for a long time, and had been counting on that stillness, and was now trying to calculate his options from the floor. "He paid you," Clara said. "The flour and the grain. He paid you to do it before the storm so you could be inside when it happened. So you couldn't be traced back to him." She crouched down to his eye level. "Am I wrong?" Belk's jaw moved. "How much?" she said. "Nothing. Here's the thing," Clara said. "We have 53 people in this lodge. We have a 4-day storm outside. And you just tried to make sure those 53 people would run short on food in the worst part of winter." She paused. "That's not a business dispute between Caldwell and Mr. Walker. That's something else entirely. And when those 53 people find out what you did—" "Clara," Ethan said. "I'm making a point," she said. "I can see that." He looked at Belk. "Here's your choice. You tell me what Caldwell put you up to exactly and completely. Or I let this lodge full of men know what you just tried to do to their food supply, and I step outside for a few minutes and let them form their own response." A very long silence. Then Belk talked. He talked for 15 minutes. He told them about the arrangement with Caldwell, money paid through a third party, instructions on what to damage and when a signal system for reporting back. He told them about 2 other men Caldwell had placed in the lodge over the winter, both of whom Ethan quietly pulled aside within the hour. He told them that Caldwell had a legal strategy building in Durango, a formal complaint to the territorial magistrate, not Henderson, but one further up the chain, claiming that Black Pine Lodge was operating unsafely and should be seized and placed under new management. "New management," Ethan repeated when Belk was done. "His people," Belk said. He was going to buy it through the complaint process, make it look official. Clara stood up. Her knees ached from crouching. She pressed her hands flat on the storage shelf and breathed and thought. "He's not going to let this go," she said. "No," Ethan said. "Then we need to get to Henderson before the storm breaks." Ethan looked at her. Henderson already saw the lodge. Henderson saw the lodge before Caldwell files his complaint with the territorial magistrate. We need Henderson on the record before that filing happens. She looked at Belk. "And we need him on the record about this." "Belk's word against Caldwell's," Ethan said. "Not just his word, yours, mine, Tommy's, Doyle's, Griggs, May and Robert, they're witnesses to how this lodge operates." She paused. "And those flour sacks. A territorial magistrate who sees wet flour sacks in a properly maintained storage system in a lodge that has been documented as well run by Henderson himself is looking at evidence of deliberate sabotage. Not negligence. Sabotage." Ethan was quiet. She could see him working through it. You think like someone who spent time around lawyers, he said. I think like someone who has been in enough situations where I had to be my own advocate, she said, which amounts to the same thing. Doyle appeared in the storage room doorway. He took in the scene. Belk on the floor, Tommy still holding him, the flask of water, Clara and Ethan's faces. I heard some of it through the wall, Doyle said. How much? Ethan said. Enough. Doyle looked at Belk with an expression of profound disgust. 53 people in this lodge. I know, Ethan said. You need me to do something. Help Tommy get him somewhere secure, Ethan said. And keep it quiet for now. Doyle looked at Clara. You figured it out, he said. Tommy found him, Clara said. Tommy sat on him, Doyle said. That's different. He looked at her. You figured it out. She didn't argue with him. When Doyle and Tommy had Belk sorted and Ethan had gone to quietly deal with the other 2 men Caldwell had placed, Clara went back to the kitchen alone. She stood at the stove and she put her hands on the warm iron of it and she breathed. 53 people. The storm outside. The ruined flower she'd spent 2 days working around. Caldwell and his smooth voice and his arrangements and his plan that had been moving quietly under all of it from the beginning. Ethan telling her about his wife in the half-dark of the kitchen. Tommy Hatch sitting on a saboteur with the surprised face of someone discovering what they were made of. She was tired. She was genuinely deeply tired in a way she hadn't let herself feel until right this moment. But the thing she felt underneath the tiredness was something else. Something that had been building since she'd walked up that mountain road alone in October, since she'd stood in this broken kitchen and rolled up her sleeves, since the first bowl of stew and the first morning of biscuits and gravy and Doyle's face when she put honey bread on the table. This lodge was hers. These people were hers. This kitchen was hers. Not by ownership, not by any paper or legal standing, but by the deepest law. There was the law of the person who shows up and does the work and holds the thing together when it wants to fall apart. Caldwell thought he could take it. He was wrong. Clara Whitmore had not walked 3 days through the mountains in October to lose this place to a man in clean boots who'd never once in his life made something from nothing. She started planning the morning meal. The storm was not done, neither was she. The storm broke on the 4th day, not gently. The way mountain storms broke up here, it was less like an ending and more like a decision. The wind changed direction sometime before dawn, the sound of it shifting from that sustained battering pressure to something looser and directional. And Clara lay in her small room off the back of the kitchen and listened to the change and knew it was almost over. She'd slept 4 hours, maybe 5. She'd been running on coffee and the particular fuel of people who have too much to do to stop, and she could feel the debt of it in her bones, now that heavy underwater feeling of a body that had given more than it had and was presenting the bill. She got up anyway, because the storm breaking meant the road would open in a day, maybe 2, and that meant Caldwell could move, and that meant she and Ethan had to move first. She had the coffee on and the first pot of porridge going before anyone else was awake, and she stood at the stove in the dark kitchen and went through everything in her head the way she always did. Provisions, people, problems, in that order. Provisions. They were low, but not critical. She'd worked the compromised flour down to almost nothing, and the reserve bread she'd built up over the past 2 days had bought them the time they needed. They could feed everyone for 3 more days comfortably. A week if they stretched. People 53 in the lodge plus Belk and the 2 others, Ethan had quietly secured, which was a word she appreciated for its precision. Nobody had panicked. Nobody had done anything stupid beyond what had already been done to them. Tommy had found himself somewhere in the past 4 days and didn't entirely know what to do with it yet. Griggs had quietly become something like a deputy without anyone assigning him the role. Doyle had been steady the way mountains were steady, and she'd taken that steadiness as a gift every single time she'd felt it. Problems. Caldwell, the territorial magistrate, the complaint that was being built in Durango while they were stuck up here managing his sabotage. She was still going through it when Ethan came into the kitchen. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the coffee, at the porridge, at her face, and she could see him taking all three of those things in and understanding them. "You haven't slept," he said. "I slept." "Enough. Enough to stand up and make coffee," she said. "That's the benchmark for now." He almost smiled. He poured himself a cup and stood on the other side of the stove, and she could feel him doing the same calculation she'd been doing, because that was what she'd come to understand about Ethan Walker. He was always running the numbers, always aware of the full picture, always 5 steps ahead, except for the steps that required him to look directly at another person and tell them the truth. "The road will open tomorrow," he said. "Maybe the day after." "I know. I need to get to Henderson before Caldwell gets to the magistrate." "I know that too. It means leaving the lodge." She looked at him. "I can hold this place together for 2 days." "I didn't say you couldn't." He looked at his coffee. "I said it means leaving. That's different." She heard what he wasn't saying. Ethan Walker had been managing this lodge alone for 4 years since his wife died. And in that time, he had built a life organized specifically around not needing to trust anyone with something that mattered. She was watching him dismantle that in real time, piece by piece, and she understood the cost of it in a way she hadn't expected to. "It means you have to trust me with it," she said. "Yes." "Can you?" He looked at her directly. "Yes," he said, "just that." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the stove. "Then go," she said. "Get to Henderson. Tell him everything. Take Doyle with you. 2 witnesses are better than 1, and Doyle's word carries weight up here. And Belk. Keep him secured until you're back with Henderson. His testimony is the foundation of everything." What if Caldwell gets there first? Henderson already saw this lodge functioning. He already wrote it in his notebook. She looked up. Caldwell can say whatever he wants. Henderson's own notes contradict him. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You thought all of this through?" "I've been awake since 3 in the morning, she said. "I thought all of it through." He looked at her, that particular look. He had the one she'd been cataloging without meaning to. The one that was layered and careful and showed more than he probably intended when the light was right and she was close enough. "Clara," he said. "Go have breakfast," she said, "and then go handle Caldwell." He went. The morning Ethan left, Griggs appeared at the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a look that said he'd been working up to something. "Walker talked to me," he said. "I know," Clara said. "He said if anyone gives you trouble while he's gone." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "But I've been handling trouble since before I came up this mountain." Griggs turned his hat in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way of a large man who was trying to say something he didn't have a lot of practice saying. "I was wrong about you," he said. "First week, the way I was." Clara looked at him. Griggs had not been cruel exactly, but he'd been the leader of the laughter, the first and loudest voice of the doubt, and they both knew it. "You didn't know me," she said. "No." He looked at his hat. "But I should have waited before I decided." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked up surprised, as if he'd expected her to let him off more easily. She held his gaze. "But you figured it out," she said. "That matters." He nodded. He put his hat on. He went back to the main room, and she heard him say something to the men in there in a low, carrying voice. And though she couldn't make out the exact words, she heard the response, a kind of general settling, a collective decision being made, and she understood that Griggs was telling them something about how things were going to be managed while Ethan was gone. She went back to the stove. She had 44 people to feed for breakfast. By the time the morning meal was done and cleared, something had shifted in the lodge. It wasn't visible the way dramatic things were visible. It was in the way men moved around the kitchen to help without being asked, the way Tommy managed the storage, without her having to supervise him, the way May, who was still at the lodge with her husband while the road cleared, appeared at the kitchen door and said, "Tell me what to do," with the practical directness of a woman who didn't believe in being idle. Clara handed her an apron. "Can you bake?" she asked. Not like you, May said, but I can follow instructions. That's all I need, Clara said. They worked together all morning, and Clara found herself thinking about what Tommy had said about his mother, that a kitchen was the heart of a house. She looked at May across the work table at Tommy, checking the storage at Sears keeping the fire, and she thought that maybe the heart wasn't a place at all. Maybe it was a collection of people who'd decided without saying it directly that they were going to hold something together. The letter arrived with the first rider who came through after the road cleared. He was a young man, maybe 19, riding hard despite the still treacherous conditions, and he came up the porch steps 2 at a time and knocked like he was trying to wake the mountain. And when Clara opened the door, he was breathing fast. "Is this Black Pine Lodge?" he said. "It is." "I have a letter for a Miss Clara Whitmore." She stared at him. Nobody sent her letters. Nobody in the world outside this mountain even knew she was here, except for the people who'd turned her away in Durango and hadn't thought of her since. She took the letter. She looked at the handwriting on the outside, and she didn't recognize it. "Who sent this?" she said. "Man in Durango. Gave me $2 to bring it up soon as the road opened." The young man looked at her expectantly, like he thought there might be a response she'd want to send back. "Thank you," Clara said. She gave him coffee and a biscuit, and he was grateful enough that he stopped looking expectant. She took the letter to the kitchen, and she stood at the work table and opened it. It was from the baker who had turned her away. The man with the flower on his apron who had said the thing about physical demands. His name, she now learned, was Garrett. The handwriting was careful and a little stiff. The handwriting of a man who didn't write letters often and knew it. She read it twice. He'd heard about the storm. He'd heard from the hunters who came back down the mountain about what Black Pine Lodge had done 53 people through a 4-day blizzard. Everyone fed, everyone accounted for. He'd heard it from the trappers, and he'd heard it from the travelers, and he'd heard specifically that the cook up there had managed it alone when the owner had to leave. He wrote that word twice. Alone. He wrote that he wanted to apologize for the way he'd spoken to her. He wrote that he'd been wrong. He wrote in the stiff, careful handwriting that he was sorry for it. At the bottom, he'd added a single line, "Your father would be proud." Clara stood at the work table for a long time. She pressed both hands flat on the wood, and she breathed, and she let herself feel what the letter made her feel, which was complicated, which was the specific, complicated feeling of being seen by the person who most needed to see you. At the moment when you most needed seeing, even when it was late, even when it had been too long. Coming. She set the letter down. She folded it carefully. She put it in the pocket of her apron. Then she went back to work because there was always more work to do, and her father had also taught her that the best response to being told you'd done something well was to go do it better. Ethan came back on the 3rd day. He came in the early evening just ahead of the cold, and when she heard the horses, she was in the kitchen finishing the supper preparations, and she heard the boots on the porch, and she heard Ethan's voice, and another voice she didn't recognize, and then the main room going quiet in a specific way. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the doorway. Ethan was there. Doyle was behind him, looking tired but steady, the look of a man who had ridden hard and done what needed doing. And with them was a man she had not expected. Not Henderson, but a taller man, older, with the particular bearing of someone who held official authority and wore it without effort. Ethan looked at her across the room. His face was not the face of a man who had lost. "Clara," he said. "This is Marshal Aldrich Webb, Territorial Marshal." She looked at Webb. Webb looked at her. His eyes were the sharp, unhurried eyes of a man who processed a room in seconds and stored everything. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I've been hearing about you for about 40 miles. "I hope it was accurate," she said. "Largely," he said. "Can you show me this kitchen?" She showed him the kitchen. She showed him the storage, the organized system, the rotation, the labels, the records she kept in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. She showed him the wet flour sacks she'd set aside, and not discarded, because she'd known from the moment she found them that they were evidence, and evidence had to be preserved. She showed him the flask she'd taken from Belk's hands. Webb looked at the flour sacks for a long time. He touched one. He looked at the interior. He didn't say what he was thinking, but she could see him filing it. Then she took him to where Belk was. Belk had been in the small storage outbuilding for 3 days, with adequate food and water, and a lock that Hobbs had installed on the second day of the storm. He was not mistreated. He was not happy. When Webb walked in, Belk looked at the territorial marshal's badge, and something in him collapsed forward. The particular collapse of a man who had been waiting for whatever came next, and was relieved in a grim way to finally see it. He told Webb everything he'd told Ethan. He told it more fully because Webb asked better questions. The precise questions of a man who needed the answers to be usable in a formal proceeding. Caldwell's name, the arrangements, the money, the other 2 men who Webb had brought out earlier and questioned separately whose stories matched Belk's with enough consistency to matter. When it was done, Webb stood outside the outbuilding with Ethan and Clara in the cold evening air, and he was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell has filed his complaint with the magistrate in Denver," he said. Ethan's jaw tightened. The complaint alleges mismanagement and negligence in the operation of a critical mountain shelter. Webb said, resulting in hazardous conditions for travelers. He looked at Clara. His specific allegation is that the hiring of an unqualified cook, his words led to inadequate food management during the November storm. Clara was very still. "He put it on you specifically," Ethan said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, a cold fury that was different from the controlled anger she knew, something more personal. "Yes," Webb said. "He did." "And," Clara said. Webb looked at her. "And I have Henderson's notes written before the storm documenting this lodge as properly provisioned and competently managed. I have the testimony of 3 individuals Caldwell placed here to commit sabotage. I have physical evidence of deliberate interference with a food supply. And I have—" He paused. "The account of 53 people who passed through this storm without a single serious incident, all of whom I'll be taking statements from before I leave." "Is that enough?" Clara said. "For a criminal complaint against Caldwell, yes," Webb said. "For the Denver magistrate to dismiss the management complaint, yes." He looked at her directly. "Caldwell made a mistake when he put your name in that filing, Miss Whitmore. He made it personal in a way that makes his motive obvious. A man who files a complaint against a lodge and spends 3 paragraphs describing the cook's appearance isn't complaining about safety standards." Clara breathed. "He described my appearance," she said. "He did." She looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at Webb with an expression that was ice cold. 3 paragraphs, Ethan said. 3? Webb confirmed. "That's going to be a problem for him," Ethan said. "It already is," Webb said. Webb took statements all the next morning. He was methodical and thorough, and the men of the lodge went in one at a time and came out looking like they'd done something that mattered because they had. Griggs went in and came out with his shoulders straighter. Doyle went in and came out with the same expression he always had, which was the expression of a man at peace with having done the right thing. Tommy went in looking nervous and came out looking like he'd just discovered a version of himself he hadn't known existed. May went in with her husband, and they were in there for 20 minutes, and when they came out, May stopped in front of Clara. "I told him what I saw when we came in," she said. "The state of this place, the food, the way people were treated." She looked at Clara steadily. "I told him that the woman running this kitchen is the reason my husband and I are standing here right now instead of frozen on that mountain road." Clara opened her mouth. "Don't you tell me that's not true," May said. "I've watched you for a week. I know what you did here." Clara closed her mouth. She looked at May, this practical-faced woman who'd come in out of a blizzard with frost on her coat, and shaking hands, and she felt something she'd been holding at a distance for a very long time move closer. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," May said. "And I mean it all the way down." Done. The second twist came the afternoon of the 4th day, and it came from the direction of a man no one had been watching. Harmon. He'd been quiet since the confrontation in the storage room. Quiet and present and ordinary, doing his work, eating his meals, giving Clara a wide and careful berth. She'd watched him the way she watched everything peripherally while doing other things, and she'd decided he was chastened and angry about being chastened, and would nurse it privately and move on. She was wrong about one part of that. He came to the kitchen in the mid-afternoon when the lodge was at its quietest, that 2-hour stretch between the midday meal and the supper preparations when most men were sleeping or working outside. He came in and stood in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him, kept her hands on the vegetables she was cutting. "Tell me." "Caldwell told me things," he said. "When he paid my brother-in-law to set up Belk. He told him things and my brother-in-law told me." He paused. He was uncomfortable, and he knew she could see it, and he'd decided to be uncomfortable anyway, which she gave him some credit for. "He's got a judge in Denver, not the magistrate, higher than that. A man who owes him something the way men owe each other things when money changes hands in the right rooms." Clara set down the knife. "He's been planning this for 2 years," Harmon said. "The lodge isn't the only property. He's doing this on the whole North Road. He wants every shelter, every station, every supply post between here and the pass. He wants to own the whole road." She stared at him. "How many properties?" "6 that I know of. He's taken 3 already. The others are—" He stopped. "This lodge is the one he needs most, because it's the only one on the North Mountain section. Without this place, he controls all access." "You knew this when you came here," she said. His jaw moved. "My brother-in-law needed the money. My wife's sick. I needed the money." He looked at the floor. "I knew what Caldwell was doing. I didn't know about the food. I didn't know about the flour. That part—" He stopped. "I have kids. I know what it means when people can't eat." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at this complicated, morally compromised man standing in her kitchen with his guilty truth and his sick wife and his brother-in-law who'd made a bad deal. And she thought about what her father used to say, that people were not simple, and that the measure of a person was not the worst thing they'd ever done but what they did when they had the chance to do better. "You need to tell Webb," she said. "I know." "Today." "I know." He looked up. "I don't know what that means for me." "I don't either," she said. "But it's the right thing." He stood there for another moment. Then he nodded one short nod, the kind that meant a man had settled something with himself, and he went to find Webb. She stood at the work table and processed what he'd told her. A judge in Denver. A 2-year plan. 6 properties. The whole North Road. She thought about Ethan's father building this lodge 40 years ago with $12 and a mule. She thought about what a man like Caldwell wanted with a thing like that, not the lodge itself, not the service it provided, but the control, the ownership, the ability to decide who got through and who didn't, and at what price. She went to find Ethan. Gade. He was in his office, a small room off the main hall that she'd only been in twice before, and he was sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and the look of a man who was doing his thinking the hard way. She came in and closed the door behind her, and she told him what Harmon had told her. She watched his face as she talked, watched the stillness of it, the controlled precision with which Ethan Walker received bad news. Not shock, not panic, but a kind of cold, exact absorption, like a man taking a measurement. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "A judge," he said. "That's what Harmon says." "Webb can deal with a compromised judge. Webb can start a process that deals with one," she said. "This isn't something that gets fixed in a week, but the process has to start here with what we have." Ethan looked at his hands on the desk. "He wants the whole road," he said. "Yes." "This was never just about my lodge." "No." He was quiet again. Then, "My father's lodge was the first thing he built, before the house, before anything. He built this because people needed it." He looked up at her. "A man like Caldwell doesn't understand that." He looks at this place and he sees a commercial asset and a strategic position. He can't see what it actually is. What is it? Clara said. Ethan looked at her directly. A place where people who are in trouble find help, he said. That's all it ever was. That's all my father built it to be. She looked at him. In the small room in the plain afternoon light, this was the clearest she'd ever seen Ethan Walker. Not the armored man, not the mountain man, who trusted nobody, but the man who had kept his father's lodge running for 4 years alone. Because it was the right thing to do. And he didn't know how to stop doing the right thing, even when it cost him everything. Then we make sure Webb understands that, she said. Not just the sabotage, the whole picture. What Caldwell's building, what it means for every shelter and every traveler on that road. He'll listen. He listened to everything we gave him today, she said. He's that kind of man. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Outside the small room, she could hear the lodge, the sounds of it, the life of it, the particular noise of a place that was full of people who had nowhere else to go and were being held together by something they couldn't quite name. Clara, he said. Yes. When this is resolved. He stopped. He started again. When Caldwell is dealt with and the road is safe and the spring comes, he stopped again. She watched him, this man who had run a mountain lodge alone for 4 years and never found the words for the things that mattered most. I don't want you to leave, he said. She was very still. I know that's not. He looked at his hands. I know you came here for a job. I know this place was never supposed to be permanent, but I want you to know that it could be. He looked up. If you wanted it to be. She held his gaze. She thought about 17 cents and a closed door and a 3-day walk up a mountain road alone. She thought about her father's rolling pin in her bag and his voice in her chest saying, "Don't let them take this from you." She thought about the flowers she'd worked through the night and the fried apples on the first real snow day, and Tommy's face when he sat on Belk and Doyle's nod from across the room, and May saying thank you all the way down. She thought about this man across the desk who had watched her work for 2 months and said, "I see you, Clara," in the most offhand, honest way she'd ever been seen. "Let's get through Caldwell first," she said. It wasn't yes. He heard it as exactly what it was, which was not no, and the difference between those two things was the size of a future, and they both understood that. All right, he said. She went back to the kitchen. She had supper to make and Webb to brief about Harmon and 44 people to feed and a fight coming that wasn't over yet by a long measure. But she moved through the kitchen with something different in her step now. Not just the determined forward movement of a woman who had always had to earn every inch of ground she stood on, but something warmer than that. The feeling of a person who is standing in a place that is improbably and truly and without condition exactly where she belongs. Webb left on the 5th day with Belk in custody, with the other 2 men Caldwell had placed with a notebook full of signed statements with the wet flour sacks wrapped in oilcloth as evidence, and with Harmon's testimony written out in the precise legal language that Webb had quietly translated from Harmon's rough guilty telling of it. Before he mounted up, he stood on the porch with Ethan and Clara, and he said, "This is going to take time." "How much time?" Ethan said. "Caldwell has money and he has connections, and he has a judge in Denver who owes him something. Those things don't unravel in a week." Webb looked at both of them steadily. "But they do unravel. What you've given me is enough to start the process. The physical evidence alone is enough to open an investigation. And once an investigation opens on a man like Caldwell, other things tend to come out." "And the complaint he filed against the lodge," Clara said. "Henderson's notes and 53 signed statements are a more compelling document than whatever Caldwell's lawyer wrote," Webb said. "The Denver magistrate will dismiss it. Might take a month." "A month," Ethan said. "I know that's not nothing," Webb said, "but it's survivable." He looked at Clara when he said it. She wasn't sure if that was intentional. He tipped his hat to her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've met a lot of people in a lot of difficult situations. You have a particular quality." "What quality is that?" she said. "You don't spend any time being afraid when there's work to be done," he said. That's rarer than it sounds." He rode out. Clara watched him go until the trees took him, and then she turned around and went back inside because there was breakfast to finish, and she'd left Tommy with the porridge, and Tommy had a tendency to let porridge go too thick if nobody was watching. The lodge emptied slowly over the next 4 days as the road cleared and people made their way back to wherever they were going. They left in groups and pairs alone, the hunters with their gear, the travelers with their bags, the mountain workers heading back to the camps. Each one stopped at the kitchen before they left. Not all of them said something. Some of them just looked at Clara with the specific look of a person who wants to communicate something they don't have words for, and she understood it each time, and she nodded each time, and they went. Griggs was one of the last to go. He stood in the kitchen doorway on the morning of the 8th day with his pack over his shoulder and his hat on, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's still processing. "I'm heading back down to the south camps," he said. "I know," she said. "Safe travels." He turned his hat in his hands. She'd noticed he did this when he was working up to something, and then he said, "I'm going to tell people what happened up here." "You don't need to do that." "I want to," he said. He looked at her steadily. "People should know what you did. The kind of person who does what you did, people should know that's out here." Clara looked at him. The big, loud man, who had laughed first and loudest when she walked through the door 2 months ago, was standing in her kitchen, asking her permission to tell her story. "Tell it honestly," she said. "I always do," he said. Then, to her complete surprise, he reached up and tipped his hat, a real tip, deliberate, the kind that meant something. "Ma'am," he said. He went. She stood at the stove and she listened to his boots on the porch, and then in the yard, and then gone. And she felt something in her chest that was too large to look at directly, so she went back to the porridge. Tommy was the one who stayed. She didn't ask him to, and Ethan didn't ask him to. And yet the morning after the last of the travelers left, Tommy was in the kitchen at dawn with his sleeves already rolled. "I figured you could use help," he said. "I can always use help," she said. "Then I'll stay," he said in the simple way he had, as if the decision had been obvious and only needed saying. She handed him a pot. He went to work. And she thought about what it meant that this disorganized young man who'd arrived at a mountain lodge looking like his parts hadn't settled, had found something here, some version of himself that had a shape and a purpose. And she thought that if she'd done nothing else, that alone was worth the 3-day walk. The month that Webb had promised was in fact 6 weeks, and they were not easy weeks. Caldwell made noise. He sent letters to the lodge, not to Ethan, to Clara, which she understood was deliberate, which she understood was intended to make her feel targeted and specific and exposed. The letters were legal in language and threatening in tone, and they arrived in pairs 2 weeks apart, and each one named her specifically as a central element of the complaint still active in Denver. She read each one twice. She set them aside in the drawer of her small room because they were documents, and documents had to be preserved. And she did not let Ethan see her face when she read them, because Ethan's response to those letters was going to be the same cold, focused anger it always was when Caldwell aimed at her specifically, and she needed him thinking clearly. She told him about the letters. She just didn't tell him what they said until she'd had time to process them first. "He's trying to get you to leave," Ethan said when she finally showed him the second one. "I know." "Is it working?" She looked at him. "No," she said. His jaw was doing the thing. "Clara, I've been dismissed from better places than a legal letter," she said. "Sit down and eat your supper." He sat. He ate. But he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, the way a man is quiet when he's holding something back with effort. That night after the kitchen was clean, and Tommy had gone to his bunk, and the lodge was quiet, Ethan came back to the kitchen and sat at the work table, and put both hands flat on it and said, "I need to tell you something." Clara was wiping down the stove. She kept her hands moving. "Tell me." "When I hired you," he said, "I told myself it was because I needed a cook, because the lodge needed someone who could manage the kitchen." "That was true," she said. "Yes," he said. But it wasn't all of it. He looked at his hands. When you walked up that porch and told me why you were here the way you said it, the way you looked when you said it, I knew something then that I didn't have words for. I still don't have great words for it. But I knew you were someone I needed to pay attention to. Clara set down the cloth. She turned around. I've spent 4 years not paying attention to people, he said. After Margaret. It seemed easier. It seemed like the only way to keep running this place and not... He stopped. Not fall apart, he said. I was managing. That's what I was doing. Just managing. And now, she said. He looked up at her. Now I'm not managing, he said. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but it's not managing. His voice was rougher than usual. I know you came here for a job. I know you might leave when the spring comes and there are other places, and you've proven what you needed to prove. I'm not asking you to... He stopped again. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. Ask me, she said. A long beat. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the mountain was quiet the way mountains are quiet at night, which was the deepest quiet she'd ever known. Stay, he said. Not because the lodge needs you, because I... He stopped. He looked at her with the most open expression she'd ever seen on his face. All the armor down, just the man underneath it, tired and honest and real. Because I would miss you, he said, considerably. Clara stood at the stove and looked at him. She thought about the things she'd carried up that mountain road. Her father's rolling pin, his paring knife, his handwritten recipes. 17 cents, and the absolute bone-deep need to be somewhere that was worth being. She thought about what Ethan Walker had said to her in the lamplight 2 months ago. I see you, Clara. She thought about the bread they'd made together in the storm, his 2 strong hands learning to be gentle with the dough, and the way he'd talked about his wife in the quiet kitchen, like the words had needed somewhere safe to go. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, she said again clearly. I decided that a while ago. I was waiting for you to ask properly. Something crossed his face, something that started slow and became, for just a moment, uncomplicated. She hadn't seen him uncomplicated before. It suited him. That's something, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. She picked up her cloth and turned back to the stove, and behind her she heard him exhale one long, slow, controlled breath. The breath of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a very long time. The news from Webb came on a Thursday, which was an ordinary Thursday in every other way. Clara was making bread. Tommy was managing the storage. Hobbs was repairing something on the porch, and Ethan was going over the winter ledger. It was an ordinary morning, which was the particular gift of a lodge that was functioning the way it was supposed to function, and Clara had learned to receive that gift consciously, to notice it when it was happening. The rider came in mid-morning with a letter from Webb, and Ethan read it in the main room, and then came to the kitchen doorway with the letter in his hand and his face doing the thing where she couldn't read it immediately. Tell me, she said. Denver dismissed the complaint, he said. She stopped. All counts. Henderson's documentation and the signed statements were sufficient. The Denver magistrate noted specifically that the filing contained evidence of personal bias on the part of the complainant. He paused. That's the 3 paragraphs about your appearance. And Caldwell's judge. Webb opened a separate investigation into the relationship between Caldwell and Judge Marbury. Marbury has recused himself from anything Caldwell adjacent pending the outcome. He looked at the letter again. The sabotage charges are moving forward. Belk has made a full confession. The other 2 followed. A pause. Caldwell's lawyer filed a counter-complaint yesterday claiming his client had no knowledge of the actions taken at this lodge. Does anyone believe that? She said. Webb says no. Ethan looked up. The money transfers are traceable. Harmon's brother-in-law has records. Caldwell's arrangement of the whole thing is documented in enough detail that his lawyer's filing looks like what it is. Clara breathed. She pressed her hands on the work table and breathed. It's not over, Ethan said. Webb was clear about that. Caldwell has money, and he's going to fight it. This could take another year. But the lodge is safe, she said. The lodge is safe. She looked at him. He was still standing in the doorway with the letter in his hand. This tall, careful man who had built walls for 4 years and was taking them down piece by piece with the same deliberate patience he put into everything. Your father's lodge, she said. My lodge, he said quietly. Then, our lodge. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her bread because the dough was at a critical point and she couldn't leave it. And behind her, she heard Ethan go to the main room and call for Tommy. And she heard him tell Tommy the news. And she heard Tommy's voice go high and young and genuinely delighted in the way of someone who hadn't yet learned to keep delight at a professional distance. We won, Tommy said. We won the first part, Ethan said. There's more ahead. But we won the first part, Tommy said with the certainty of a young man who understood which sentence mattered. Yeah, Ethan said. We won the first part. Clara kept working the dough. She was smiling, and she didn't try to stop it. The twist came 3 days later, and it came from Caldwell himself. He rode in on a gray morning with only one man behind him, no lawyer, no entourage, no performance. He rode in the way a man rides when he's come to do something he's thought about carefully, and the absence of the usual trappings was the thing that told her this was different. Ethan was in the main room. Clara was in the kitchen. She heard the horses, and she came to the doorway, and she looked at Caldwell, and she read him the way she read everything fast and thorough from the outside in. He was not the same man who had stood in her kitchen with his practiced smile and his 3 paragraphs. He was older looking, which 6 weeks of a collapsing scheme could do to a person, and his posture had changed in some indefinable way, a degree or two less certain the way a structure looks when something load-bearing has been removed. Ethan stood up. Caldwell, he said. Walker. Caldwell looked around the room. He looked at the lodge, the fire, the clean tables, the organized and functional space, the evidence everywhere of a place that was being properly run. He looked at all of it with an expression she could not entirely read. I'm not here to fight, he said. Then why are you here? Ethan said. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. I came to make a different kind of offer, he said. Not for the lodge. He paused. I want to withdraw the complaint, formally. I want Webb to know I'm withdrawing cooperation with the counter-complaint and I'm not contesting the sabotage investigation. The room was very still. Why? Ethan said. Caldwell looked at the table. He looked at his hat in his hands. Clara noticed that the hat, the same gesture she'd seen on better men when they were trying to say something they didn't have easy words for, and the fact that it was the same gesture on this man made her feel something complicated. My daughter, he said. Ethan waited. She's 12 years old, Caldwell said. Her mother brought her to see me last week, in Durango. He was quiet. She'd heard things, about what happened up here. He stopped. He looked at the table. She asked me if it was true that I'd tried to hurt people's food supply. He stopped again. The pause was long enough to be real. She's 12, he said. She looked at me like she was waiting for me to be someone she could be proud of. The room was still. I'm not doing this for Webb, Caldwell said. I'm not doing it because the investigation is going to win, although it is. I'm doing it because my daughter asked me a question, and I don't want to be the kind of man whose answer disappoints her. Clara watched him. She had spent months understanding Nathan Caldwell as a type, the smooth money man, the operator, the person who moved pieces on a board and didn't look at what the pieces were made of. And he was that. He was all of that. But he was also a man whose 12-year-old daughter had looked at him and asked a question, and the question had done what the territorial marshal and the signed statements and the weight of the evidence hadn't done, which was, reach him somewhere real. She thought about what her father used to say. People are not simple. Walker, Caldwell said. I know I can't fix what I did here. I know that's not how it works. He looked at Ethan directly. But I can stop making it worse. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. You'd put that in writing, he said. Yes. Everything. The withdrawal, the counter-complaint, the cooperation with the investigation. Yes. Another long silence. Ethan looked at Clara. It was the briefest look, a question, not a request for permission, just the look of a man who had gotten into the habit of checking the measure of things with the person he trusted most. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked back at Caldwell. Sit down, he said. I'll get the paper. Caldwell sat, and Clara went back to the kitchen because there were things she felt right now that were too large and too layered to process in front of anyone. Things about justice and its imperfect human shapes, about people being not simple, about the particular mercy of a 12-year-old girl who had asked her father a question at the right moment. She stood at the stove, and she put her hands on it, and she breathed, and she let herself feel all of it, the months of it, the work of it, the fear she'd never let herself show, and the anger she'd managed into action, and the grief she'd carried forward, and the love she'd poured into every meal in this kitchen for people who needed it. She was still standing there when Tommy came in with the particular face he had when something big had happened that he was still processing. Did you see that? He said. I heard most of it, she said. He just gave up, Tommy said. Not exactly, she said. He chose something. Tommy thought about this. His daughter, he said. Yes. That's... He searched for the word. That's real, he said. Yes, Clara said. It is. Caldwell's written withdrawal reached Webb within the week. The formal dropping of the counter-complaint meant that the sabotage investigation moved forward without obstruction, and 2 months later, Belk and the other 2 men received the legal consequences of what they'd done, and the investigation into Judge Marbury's relationship with Caldwell produced enough material that Marbury resigned his position quietly in March. The North Road survived the winter, and Black Pine Lodge survived it with 30 fewer crises than any previous year on record, which Doyle mentioned to Ethan in the spring, in the specific tone of a man who was noting something for the official history. Spring came. The way spring always came in the mountains. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. Warm days fighting cold days, the snow retreating and then reasserting, and then retreating again for good. And one morning, Clara walked out of the kitchen, and the air smelled like something alive and wet and new. She stood on the porch. Hobbs was doing something to the railing he'd been meaning to fix all winter. Tommy was bringing wood from the pile with the steady rhythm of a young man who had found his footing. Ethan was at the stable doing the morning work, moving with the unhurried competence of a man in a place he understood completely. The letter from Garrett the baker in Durango was still in her apron pocket. Not the original, she'd put the original in the small box where she kept her father's things, but she'd copied out the last line on a smaller piece of paper, and she kept it in her pocket because some things needed to be close. Your father would be proud. She pressed her hand against the pocket and felt the folded paper inside it, and she talked to her father the way she still sometimes did, not out loud, not formally. Just the interior conversation of a person who learned from someone they loved and carries that person's voice as a permanent part of their own thinking. I'm here, she told him. I found it, the place you said would exist, place you said. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch steps before she saw him. She'd learned his footstep the way you learn things about people when you live close to them and pay attention. The particular sound of him, the particular rhythm. He came and stood beside her on the porch. He looked at the morning. She looked at the morning. Ryder came in an hour ago, he said. Man on his way north. He'd heard about the lodge from some hunters out of Durango. A pause. He said he'd heard this was the best food between here and the pass. Clara looked at the mountains. What did you tell him? I told him to go see the cook, Ethan said. She was quiet for a moment. The best food between here and the pass, she said. That's what he said. That's a long stretch of territory. Yes, Ethan said. It is. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her in the way he had, that was direct and serious, and didn't look away when she caught it. the way of a man who had decided that looking away was something he used to do and wasn't going to anymore. "I got another letter," she said. "From Durango. A woman who runs a boarding house. She heard about the storm and what happened here. She wants to know if I'd consider consulting on her kitchen operations." She paused. "For a fee." Ethan was still. "She's not the only one," Clara said. "There have been 2 others. Word travels, I suppose." "Are you telling me you're leaving?" he said. His voice was even. She knew him well enough now to know what even cost him. "I'm telling you people are asking," she said. "That's different from leaving." He breathed. "Clara, I told you in February," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "But I want you to know that I'm staying because I'm choosing to. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because I need the position. Because I am choosing this place and these people and—" She paused. "And you, specifically." The word landed between them and stayed. Ethan looked at her. All the careful distance was gone. The armor he'd worn for 4 years that she'd watched him take apart piece by piece over the past months was not there this morning, on this porch in this spring light. There was just the man, steady and quiet and real. "I would like to be chosen specifically," he said. "Good," she said. He took her hand. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about Ethan Walker. Everything he did was quiet and deliberate and meant. But he took her hand the way a person takes something they intend to keep, and she let him. They stood on the porch of Black Pine Lodge in the first real morning of spring and looked at the mountains and didn't say anything else for a while because everything that needed saying had been said and everything else was the work ahead of them, which was considerable and real and exactly the kind of work that Clara Whitmore had been made for. The hearing in Denver was in April. Clara went with Ethan. She had not been asked to testify. Webb had told them her statement was part of the record and her presence was not required. But she went anyway, because some things you show up for, not because it's required, but because it's right. The courtroom was formal and strange, after the mountain full of wood and paper and men in good coats, and Clara sat beside Ethan, and she felt him take a breath when Caldwell walked in, and she put her hand on his arm, and he steadied. Caldwell had made good on every promise. His written withdrawal was in the record. His cooperation with the investigation was documented. He sat across the room with his lawyer, and he did not look at Ethan, and he did not look at Clara. But once near the end of the proceedings, when the presiding judge was reading aloud from the collected evidence, Caldwell looked up and found Clara's eyes. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked at him the way she looked at everything, steadily, clearly, without flinching. He looked back down. The judge ruled at 2 in the afternoon. The complaint against Black Pine Lodge was dismissed with prejudice, which Webb explained meant it could not be refiled. The sabotage charges stood and would proceed to their own hearing. The investigation into the broader land acquisition scheme on the North Road was formally opened, which meant the other 5 properties Caldwell had targeted would have legal protection during the process. Outside the courthouse in the April afternoon, Webb shook Ethan's hand and then looked at Clara. "The physical evidence," he said. "The flour sacks. The way you preserved them, documented them, kept them dry and properly stored as evidence that was the foundation of the physical case. I want you to know that." "I just kept them the way I keep everything in storage," Clara said. "Organized and protected." Webb almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." He went. Doyle, who had come down for the hearing, clapped Ethan on the shoulder with the economy of a man who expressed everything in the fewest possible gestures. And then he started for his horse, because he had a long ride back. "Doyle," Clara called. He turned. "The honey bread," she said. "I'll make it Sunday." He looked at her. 15 years on a mountain, this man, and what moved across his face when she said that, was something private and genuine and untranslatable. "Appreciate it," he said. His voice was rough. He wrote out, Ethan stood beside her on the street outside the Denver courthouse, and the city moved around them, busy and loud, and nothing like a mountain lodge. He looked out of place here, this mountain man in this city street, and she thought that was exactly right. He belonged somewhere specific, and he knew it, and he'd built his life around it, and that was one of the things she loved about him. She thought that. She let herself think it directly, which she hadn't quite done before the word and everything it meant. "Ready to go home," he said. She looked at him. Home. She had spent 7 months looking for the thing that word was supposed to mean after her father, after the closed doors, after the turned-away eyes and the cold calculations, and the particular loneliness of a person who is seen only as what other people assume rather than what she is. She had found it in the most unlikely of places, which was also the only place it had ever made sense to look in the middle of work that mattered, surrounded by people worth feeding, chosen by a man who looked at her and saw exactly who she was and called it enough, more than enough. Yes, Clara Whitmore said, and she meant it all the way down to the bedrock of herself, the way her father had taught her to mean things, the way a woman who had never once stopped moving finally comes to rest in the place that was always waiting for her, sure and solid and entirely, undeniably her own.